The world is awash with lethal weapons. Now the United Nations is aiming to regulate a global weapons market estimated to cost some 750,000 lives per year. So why is the US among those resisting some of the measures? You're watching Inside Story Americas from Washington. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu. It's an industry valued at more than $60 billion a year, and so far it's operated with virtually no regulation. But now delegates from around the world are aiming to change all that with the first ever binding treaty on the global weapons market. The United Nations is hosting a month of negotiations with many countries convinced that a convention is needed to prevent illicit arms from falling into the wrong hands. It's estimated that there are some 750,000 arms-related deaths each year. But despite that, there's no guarantee a treaty will be implemented. Some of the proposed measures are being strongly opposed by the United States, Russia and China. For its part, the US is against binding language that would prohibit arms transfers to countries if there's evidence they could be used to undermine human rights. It also opposes the inclusion of ammunition. Al Jazeera's Kristen Salumi reports from the United Nations in New York.
Guns, grenades, helicopters. Arms are a $60 billion a year business with the potential to escalate conflicts and contribute to atrocities. And right now, it's an open market.
I'm speaking to the whole American population.
Femi Karula wants to change that. He fled Syria in 1992 after he was jailed and beaten for speaking out against the government. Now he's joining other activists, campaigning for the first ever arms trade treaty.
I want every human being anywhere to live his life without the threat of being tortured because a bad guy has a weapon.
Activists are handing out bananas to make the point that while fruit and bottled water are subject to strict international trade rules, conventional weapons can go around the globe with few constraints, and this allows them to get into the hands of dictators, armed groups, and human rights abusers.
Treaty supporters point to Russian arms sales to Syria as the most vivid example of the need to regulate the arms trade. As it's proposed, the treaty would forbid the sale of weapons to countries likely to use them to commit human rights abuses. But it could also prevent arming rebel groups, as U.S. allies Saudi Arabia and Qatar have been accused of in the conflict in Syria. For the first time, the United States, the world's largest exporter of weapons, is prepared to sign on to the treaty. Proponents acknowledge the real battle will be implementation.
The bad people will find always ways to get what they want. But this treaty will hinder them. It will make their job harder.
And that, says Karula, is the very least the international community can do for the Syrian people and all those living under the threat of violence. Kristen Salumi, Al Jazeera, the United Nations.
So, will the United Nations Arms Treaty succeed? With me to discuss this is Frank Januzzi, the head of the Washington, D.C. office of Amnesty International. From Atlanta, former U.S. Assistant Secretary of Defense Lawrence Korb, and also joining us, Daryl Kimball, the Executive Director of the Arms Control Association. Thanks to all of you for joining us. First, this conference taking place in New York, it's a major conference, more than 190 nations, and it's a month long. So I was wondering, what exactly are the delegates trying to achieve? As I understand it, you can sell weapons to another country as long as that country provides something called an end-user certificate, which means that they're going to say these guns or whatever weapons they are meant for our use here, so you know who you're selling to. Daryl, how does the UN treaty hope to change that?
Well, the problem today is that there's a patchwork of national regulations regarding the export and import of conventional weapons. Incredibly, only about 90 countries have any laws to regulate the import and export of these weapons. And then only about 52 have laws regarding brokering, reselling these weapons by individuals. So shady arms dealers and countries intent on selling weapons to countries can get around the national controls. And furthermore, there are no common international standards that guide when countries can and should not transfer, sell, gift, conventional arms from one country to another. So this treaty is designed to raise the standards, to close those gaps. It's not going to solve all the problems, but this is a severe problem that's costing lives around the world every day. And this conference is an effort to begin to solve this problem.
Okay, let's go to Larry Korb in Atlanta. Larry, the United States is a big player in this. It's a big manufacturer of arms. It's a big exporter of arms. What specifically are the U.S. objections to what is being tabled in New York right now?
Well, the United States basically feels that any international organization, I should say some do, doesn't have U.S. interests at heart and will, you know, for example, if you look at the Law of the Sea Treaty, which even our military people support, there are people say no, they'll use this to constrain the United States from doing what's necessary to protect its national security. I think the next thing they're concerned about is not only the amount of arms we sell, and as our defense budget goes down, they don't want to put any crimp in that. I mean, last year we sold $44 billion worth of arms around the world. But for example, when you sell arms to Saudi Arabia, which is our biggest customer, what happens if the Saudis then, as they have done, help the people in Bahrain to put down some of the popular uprising? Will people say you can no longer sell to the Saudis? What will people say, or some of these international, if we sell arms to Israel, and then there are problems, you know, with dealing with the Palestinians in the disputed territories? And I think that's what the concern is, that it'll keep the United States from protecting what it sees as its national interest.
Okay. Frank, does this treaty aim to put in place some kind of criteria that will have to be met before a country can buy weapons?
Yes, it does. And the essence of the treaty really is to attempt to restrict the international trade of arms in those circumstances where there is a substantial risk that the export of those weapons are going to contribute to serious human rights violations. No one expects this treaty to curtail the ability of nation states to sell weapons to their allies, to defend themselves, to promote law and order, to ensure their security. But in those situations, as we now face in the Congo, in Sudan, in Syria, where there's a very real risk that the export of these weapons and ammunition are going to contribute to serious violations of international humanitarian law, then the export ought not to proceed. That seems like common sense. And at present, unfortunately, there are no global standards that prohibit such exports.
Well, here's the point, and it's a point that Larry made. Bahrain is an ally of the United States. The United States supplies weapons to Bahrain. Bahrain has been, the regime there has been putting down a protest. Under the terms of what is being proposed in New York, would Bahrain be precluded from buying weapons from the United States?
It's a great question. The U.S. Congress has already attempted to set up a standard that would explain to the U.S. government the circumstances under which such exports ought or ought not to be allowed. The treaty would leave it to each nation to decide for itself whether or not they believe that export is going to run the substantial risk of contributing to human rights violations, as opposed to restoring law and order with the weapons being used responsibly. But it would also empower civil society in those countries and the international community to hold other nations accountable for those decisions. So if Russia tried to justify arms sales to Syria on the grounds that this was somehow going to reduce violence rather than increase it, the treaty by itself would not prevent them from doing so, but it would open them up to international scrutiny, and I don't think it would pass the laugh test.
Okay, well, let's look at which countries are the big players in the global arms trade. The two biggest arms exporters by far are the United States and Russia, with 30% and 24% of all exports respectively. They're followed by Germany, France, the United Kingdom and China. The picture in terms of imports is more fragmented, but India is the biggest importer, followed by South Korea, Pakistan and China. And of course, it comes as no surprise that the biggest objections to this treaty come from the United States, Russia and China. Daryl.
Well, actually, I mean, this is an unusual negotiation in that the arms buyers and the arms sellers all have their particular interests in mind. So as this 4-week-long negotiation goes on in New York, there could be a number of issues that come up that are raised by arms importers and exporters. So, I mean, what's interesting here is that, you know, we have all of the major arms suppliers involved in this negotiation. That's a good thing. The United States policy has shifted over the past couple of years. When this negotiation process began, formally back in 2006, the George W. Bush administration was opposed to it. Right. The Obama administration came in 2009. They decided they would actively engage and participate. And so we have an opportunity here to come up with common standards that arms sellers and arms buyers all can agree to. But one of the key issues, going back to the question you were asking before, is whether the treaty will require states to simply evaluate and consider these criteria, like human rights and arms embargoes, or whether it will require states not to authorize an arms transfer or import if the exporting state determines that there is a substantial risk of a human rights violation. And that's going to be one of the key issues that the states need to resolve. The current draft paper that has been put down by the president of the conference, Ambassador Mourtan of Argentina, would require that states not authorize transfers if it is determined there's a substantial risk of human rights violations. And that's what the U.S. and some of the other arms suppliers are pushing back on, because the traditional U.S. policy has been to look at all of these criteria, but to take them into consideration and figure out whether, on balance, it's in the U.S. national security interest to go ahead or not.
Right, okay, let me go to Larry Korb on that very subject. Larry, is it the U.S. view that national security always trumps any other considerations, whether they be human rights, civil rights, whatever?
Well, in many cases, in the final analysis, that's what happens. I think for the most part, the United States has been pretty good about, you know, being careful to whom they would sell arms and who they would not sell arms. But in the final analysis, it's a clash between, if you will, idealism and realism. I mean, during the Cold War, we provided arms to Turkey and Greece, even after, you know, they had military dictatorships. We were providing arms to Pakistan. So in that cases, when push comes to shove, that's what normally happens. I think this treaty, this whole discussion is a step in the right direction, because it'll get people to focus on these things, and it could have some, you know, salutary long-term effect. But when it comes right down to it, great powers like Russia, the United States, and China will always go with their national interest as opposed to these other considerations.
Right, Frank, and that is going to be a big problem for this conference, isn't it? The fact that big and powerful players like the United States are going to look after their interests first.
It's a big challenge, but it really does depend on how you define one's interests. And if I can push back a little bit to what Larry said, I don't think this is really a challenge between realists and idealists. I think if you look at U.S. arms sales to Iran during the time of the Shah, we sold a lot of high-tech weaponry, which we now regret having transferred. And if there had been a human rights dimension to the consideration of those exports, if in fact such exports had been prohibited, if in fact the Shah of Iran was perpetrating severe human rights abuses against his own people with those weapons, then we might be in a very different world today. So I think that we need to look at both our short-term and long-term interests, but we need to look at the totality of our national interests. And advancing human rights is very much a realistic objective. It's not an idealistic objective.
Okay.
And if we look at what...
I'll get you in a moment, Larry.
I mean, what the Secretary General said today in his opening remarks at the conference, I mean, we also have to consider that the sale of weapons to conflict zones in developing countries in Africa, in Asia, really diminishes the ability of those countries to raise up the standards of their people. The instability that results from the conflicts sets those countries back. So if the great nations of the world, the major arms suppliers, look at the situation, I mean, they recognize that conflict in these regions is destabilizing. It's not in their security interests. And one of the big effects of this treaty is going to be to make sure that each country has some basic regulations that require the authorization of arms transfers and also regulate brokers. And it's these arms brokers that are able to navigate the holes in the international system to get arms supplies to rebel groups, drug cartels, That's what's really undermining the situation in places like Sudan, in Congo, and elsewhere.
Well, we've seen the situation with Viktor Bout, the Russian.
Viktor Bout is an excellent example of the problem that this treaty is partially designed to address.
Right. Okay, let's go to Larry in Atlanta. Larry, you were going to say.
Well, I think, again, I would hope that we would have not sold the arms to the Shah, but I don't think there's any evidence of that. Remember, we helped put him in power. We overthrew Mossadegh in 1953 in collaboration with the British, and the whole Cold War thing is, you know, we were trying to prevent what we thought was Soviet expansionism into that area. And so not only did he abuse human rights, those weapons eventually got turned against us when you know, when the Shah was put out of power. So yeah, I would hope so, and I don't want to disagree with Frank and Daryl that this is a step in the right direction. It will highlight it, it will get to the brokers, but I think when push comes to shove, every time I've looked at it, it's always, well, yes, but you know, we have a greater enemy here, you know, for example, as we do in Bahrain.
Okay, right. Frank, I guess that is the problem, isn't it? I mean, the fact is, I think there is a general consensus in New York that some kind of treaty is needed. There needs to be some kind of agreement, some kind of regulatory mechanism for the movement of arms around the world. But it's to what extent will, you know, this treaty affect me, as the United States may be saying, or China may be saying, etc. And that's going to be the tough one to crack there.
Yes, Anand, and no treaty is going to be a panacea.
Yeah.
If every nation on the planet had as rigorous an export licensing system as does the United States, there would still be the provision of arms that would, on occasion, reach unscrupulous end users and states or militia groups. But the purpose long-term is to begin to address this problem by making it harder, more expensive, more difficult for these brutal regimes and unscrupulous militia groups and armed militias to get a hold of the weaponry that they use to kill one person every minute of every day. And if this international standard can begin to reduce that trade and give nation states the tools they need to scrutinize their exports more rigorously, then it will be a major step in the right direction.
Okay. Larry, can the United States make the case that any kind of restrictions on who it can sell weapons to affects its foreign policy in essence? Because if we look at the example of Taiwan, the United States supplies weapons to Taiwan. With a treaty, will it still be able to do that?
Well, Taiwan, the government now, as opposed to when we first started arming it, is much more democratic and does not abuse human rights. I think, again, this is where you get to this whole question, because we theoretically recognize that Taiwan is part of China, and the Chinese look at this as undermining their sovereignty. I think as I understand the treaty, you probably still could, because again, they would not use it to violate human rights. They would be using it to protect themselves against what a potential attack from the mainland. And the other thing is very interesting, and Frank was mentioning this. You're talking about the Congo and places which are not part of really the strategic interest, particularly of the major powers. And so when you deal with those, it becomes easier than when you get to the hard cases like a Taiwan, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, for example.
I mean, let me just give one example of how this treaty could have a very real effect with the situation that is in the news today. I mean, we've seen the reports about Russia continuing to supply Syria with attack helicopters, according to previous contracts well before the uprising in Syria in the past few months. But very recently, a Russian ship headed for Syria was intercepted by British authorities because that ship, Russian ship, was insured by a British entity. And Britain, as a part of the EU, has to respect an EU European Union arms embargo on Syria right now. So because they had that legal authority through the EU, the UK could intercept that shipment and stop the resupply of these attack helicopters to Syria, which are being used today to attack civilians in populated areas, which I would call a clear human rights violation, which the Russians understand is a serious problem. So if this treaty were in effect, it would give many other nations the authority, the legal authority, and the political cover to take actions like that, to deal with very clear, very obvious situations in which arms are going to countries where human rights violations are being committed by the recipients of those weapons.
Yeah, and generally there is more support in the European Union for this treaty than there is in other parts of the world.
There is a strong support in the EU for this approach. Europe, for the past 15 or so years, has had a pretty clear set of policies that says that if certain basic criteria are not met, then arms shipped potentially by EU states shall not go to those countries. So it's a slightly different approach to the United States,
right.
Which is more of a take into account kind of evaluation. And so the EU is a very strong supporter. The United Kingdom was a very strong backer of this initiative beginning in 2006.
It was one of the sponsors of this treaty.
Yes.
Right. Frank, how does a treaty like this, if passed, affect sales of weapons domestically, within countries?
Well, the beauty of this treaty is it has no effect on the individual rights or the collective rights of citizens within countries to possess weapons, to purchase weapons. The critics of the treaty will tell you, oh my God, this treaty is going to strip the arms out of every law-abiding citizen in countries.
Well, I mean, we have the United States here, have a thriving arms trade inside the United States, an incredibly powerful pro-arms lobby, the National Rifle Association. I mean, they've been the biggest force to restrict trade.
And none of that trade would be affected by this treaty. This treaty governs the international movement of weapons, hopefully ammunition, between countries, brokered by individuals or countries from one country to the next. So the Second Amendment rights of every U.S. citizen are not affected at all by this treaty. And I think those who are raising these questions know that deep down, and I think they will be satisfied when they see the treaty text emerging that in fact those Second Amendment rights are in fact protected.
Okay. Larry, why was the United States so insistent that ammunition not be included in the treaty?
Well, I think with two reasons. One, what's the definition of ammunition as opposed to, does it mean missiles or just bullets, for example? And then I think the other thing is there are occasions where we would like, for example, like in Syria, as you mentioned in the run-up to or was mentioned by your reporter in the run-up to this, what about providing that ammunition, to some of those rebel groups? I think that is the concern, that we would not be able to help those who might be rebelling against their governments in one form or another. I mean, another thing, again, we if you take a look at what's happening in Somalia now, where we have Uganda taking the lead, we're doing the training, we're supplying them with some ammunition. We don't know, what Uganda might do. For example, they've taken, very strong persecution against gays, for example. Right. Would that prevent us from helping them in Somalia?
Well, as I understand the U.S. government's concerns about including ammunition in the treaty, I mean, it is, as Larry said, difficult to track what happens to ammunition supplies once they are transferred. But the United States already regulates the import and export of ammunition. We already do this. And so the United States' concern is that it's going to put an undue burden on industry and on governments to follow and track and report on what happens to the ammunition once it's transferred. But what I would argue, and I think what Amnesty International, Oxfam, all of the NGOs working for this treaty would argue, is that ammunition should be one of the items that is evaluated as part of the criteria that is established as part of this treaty, because there are more than enough guns in the world. It is the ammunition that is supplied to armies and rebel groups that fuels these conflicts. So if you don't include ammunition in the basic scope of the treaty, you're not solving the problem. I mean, you talk to the people on the ground in West Africa, and the conflicts we saw in Liberia and Sierra Leone, it was the ammunition coming in that was causing the problem. We have to include that to make this effective.
Right. Frank, we have 10 seconds. You get the last word. Steep hill in New York for all the delegates over there to climb. Are we going to see a treaty at the end of the month?
We're going to see a treaty, and hopefully it will be one that lives up to high international human rights norms.
Okay, thanks. Frank, Daryl, Larry, thanks to all of you for joining us. And that is it from the team here in Washington, D.C. for now. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Facebook, where you can find more information about the program. And of course, we want to hear from you. Tell us what stories you think we should be covering. Send your ideas directly to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Thanks for watching.